Hi, SOCA1010 students. Welcome to the final week of the course. Well done for making it through the entire semester. I hope you've enjoyed everything that we've covered in this course, and hopefully you found a few topics that particularly spark your interest, perhaps things that you'd like to look at in more detail in some of our second and third year courses. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about environmental sociology or environment and society. I think this is a really interesting topic to finish on for this course because environmental sociology is absolutely booming right now. There's for very obvious reasons to do with the kind of growing social awareness of the environmental challenges that we're facing as a species. There's a kind of growing amount of research that's looking at the intersections of the environmental and the social, and I'm going to speak to you a bit about some of the questions and approaches and areas that are focused on by environmental sociologists today. So I'm going to talk to you about generally what environmental sociology is, what the environment is more generally, because I think as I'll touch on in a minute, the term the environment is quite loaded these days. We think of the environment and we immediately think of climate change, species extinction. It carries a lot of baggage. Then I'm going to speak to you a bit about the new ecological paradigm, about anthropocentrism and ecocentrism, then some different epistemological approaches to studying the environment, constructivist and realist approaches. Hopefully those terms are somewhat familiar to you. They've most likely come up in some of your reading and discussion for this course, but if they don't ring a bell, I'll be explaining exactly what's meant by them. And then in the final part of the lecture, I'm going to talk to you about some of the key thinkers and theorists of environmental sociology who were drawn on a lot to conceptualize issues of environment and society and their intersections. And then finally, we're going to touch on climate change and the ecological footprint and what can be done about these things from a sociological perspective, or perhaps the better explanation would be, what does sociology have to contribute to the study and understanding of the environment and mitigation against something like climate change? So to start off with, talking about environmental sociology and how society and environment kind of fit together, a lot of sociological research focuses on the interactions that humans have with social systems, social structures, institutions. And as you've very much seen in this particular course, there's generally quite a lot of emphasis on inequalities within these systems, on understanding inequalities along kind of axes of class, race, gender, and other groupings such as disability, sexuality, all of those kind of identity categories and experiences. We often focus on how they can be kind of locus of inequality within our social systems. And so we can we can kind of use that as the basis for what we're often doing in sociology, and then kind of extend this sociological vision a bit further to look at not just the social structures and institutions that we interact within, but also the more general environmental context that all of this is taking place in. So we don't necessarily live in a vacuum, even though, as we've defined sociology in this course, it's a study of social behavior, of how one person's behavior would impact on that of another. But that's always taking place in an environmental context, in the context of the natural environment. So essentially, environmental sociology is trying to explain how humans relate to the ecological environment in which they interact. So it's trying to understand how humans interact within and interact with the context that they live in, this environmental kind of context. And this will kind of make a bit more sense when we talk about what exactly is meant by the environment. So at first, it seems quite natural to make a distinction between the kind of non-human world, the type of landscape you'd see in this picture here, the natural world as we might think of it, and to distinguish that with the built environment. So we don't generally think of cities, for instance, or skyscrapers when we talk about the natural environment. But this is a kind of division between nature and culture, between human and non-human made, that can be something of a false distinction. So we do need to remember that the kind of commodities that are used to make our built environments are generally, sourced from natural resources, which are converted into these kind of man-made resources through this commodification process, given an exchange value, and you know, they do come from the kind of so-called natural world. So having a very stiff distinction between nature and culture, between man-made and natural, is not really tremendously useful. I think it's also important when we're thinking about the environment, the natural environment and such, that humans are very much kind of part of this as well. We come part and parcel with our natural environment, and so I think the understanding of the environment that we're using is very broad, because when we would usually draw these boundaries and think like, oh, that's kind of the man-made environment, it's not so easy to draw a very clear distinction between natural and human in that sense, between nature and culture. The distinction's a little bit more kind of blurry than that. So I thought it would help to understand the types of work that environmental sociologists do by looking at some of the key questions that they interrogate. So one of the really key questions is, how are environmental problems known, defined, and acted upon? So rather than necessarily like going out and taking water samples from a river to try and measure levels of environmental contaminant, environmental sociologists are more interested in how humans create knowledge about the environment, how humans understand the environment. And this type of perspective, it's coming quite a bit from the kind of history and philosophy of science, because when we're trying to understand how humans interact with so-called environmental problems, this often brings us into the realm of trying to understand how scientists create the knowledge that we use to understand these things that we can't necessarily like just discern ourselves. So an example of this is the research on changes in the ozone layer. So I think the numbers on this particular slide are a little bit small, but these are kind of images of the Earth from top left-hand side is 1979, then top right-hand side 1987, bottom left-hand 2006, and then bottom right-hand 2011. So we can see the kind of distribution of ozone changing over time. We can see it decreasing over a particular area, which I believe encompasses Australia, lucky us. So a scientist who basically put forward this information about the hole in the ozone layer recounted this experience, saying, we were still trying to figure it out. We thought maybe it's an instrumental effect, or maybe it's something else. We tried to take our time and make sure the hole was real. By December 1984, we had a high degree of confidence that the hole was a real effect. We submitted a paper to a conference in Prague that was held in August 1985. My presentation showing the size and magnitude of the event, later called the ozone hole, was the first time everyone knew it was such a huge event. All hell broke loose, particularly in the media. So we can see that the kind of hole in the ozone layer was starting to take place in the late 1970s, but it's only really hitting the media, and all hell is only breaking loose in the mid 80s. So it's not that scientists created this, but the way that scientific knowledge was generated and presented this issue kind of created our human response to an understanding of it. Um, so, environmental sociologists, when they're trying to understand how environmental problems are known, defined, and acted upon, are generally looking at how science is produced socially, and that means science is how science is kind of produced by people who have their own perspectives and interests. So, of course, scientists are meant to be objective, but they are still human. And they're also, environmental sociologists are also interested in looking at the degree to which science is trusted or is under question. So the kind of question of why there is vaccine hesitancy, for instance, is a very sociological question. If scientists can say the vaccine is not risky, or for women under 50, the risk of the AstraZeneca vaccine outweighs, so the benefits of that vaccine outweigh the risk, for instance. But you know, despite scientists saying that, that doesn't necessarily then lead to the entire population going like, okay, great, sure, I accept that completely and I'm going to act accordingly. There are kind of different things at play. So the reasons why people may or may not trust in science is a very sociological question, and so it's often environmental sociologists that are trying to understand why people would or would not, for instance, believe in climate science. Environmental sociologists are also interested in why some issues are viewed as important and some issues are ignored. And so they look at why some causes are more attractive than others, why some species attract much more sympathy than others, and why the outcomes of environmental disputes can seemingly be the result of more effective campaigns, loudest voices. Essentially, they look at how some environmental issues and problems get more attention. So if we compare our pictures on the right here of our absolutely adorable koala eating some eucalypt and then a scary crab, you can imagine which one you may identify with more, which one you may want to give your money to help it stop going, prevent it from going extinct. And there is a genuine issue with the amount of donations and support that are given to more attractive and appealing animals than compared to less attractive and appealing animals. So you can imagine if it is if you're choosing between giving your money to a campaign to save the elephants, a creature which has often been given the kind of term of charismatic megafauna because everyone wants to save the elephants. The elephants are beautiful. If it's a choice between that and saving the kind of a giant slug or like a blobfish, I think you can see why it is more likely that the elephant or the koala or the kind of cute, attractive, interesting animal is going to attract a bit more attention. But that's kind of an issue because some of the ugly or less appealing animals are very ecologically important and arguably just as deserving of a conservation focus. So environmental sociologists are interested in how do some issues become constructed or socially imagined to be more important than others. How does this happen? Why does this happen? So again, these are very sociological questions. And Environmental sociologists are also interested in the roles of larger actors, institutions, and economic networks in shaping the relationships that we have with non-human environments. So we can think about like petrol and fuel as an example of this. Environmental sociologists would be interested in the kind of politics of drilling for oil, of accessing oil, the environmental impact of this, the way that it's understood by the populations that live close to these drilling sites. And then they would be interested in how we relate to kind of petrol and how maybe changes in fuel costs change our relationship with driving, how often we drive, whether that would actually limit our driving, how expensive would fuel have to be before all of us just decided, okay, I'm just going to take public transport. What is that threshold point? Again, those are sociological questions. And then finally, there's a kind of interesting sociological questions to be asked about which kinds of vehicles people choose and the kind of whether at what point is someone going to be more likely to choose a more fuel efficient or environmentally friendly vehicle. Is that a priority? Is it more or less of a priority than cost, than the appearance of the vehicle? All of those kinds of questions, again, they can't necessarily be answered by the engineers who are designing these vehicles. There needs to be kind of input from those that are studying how these objects are understood and related to by humans within their lived environments to kind of complete that picture. And then finally, environmental sociologists are interested in how different social groups are affected by environmental problems and controversies. So some of you would recognise the image here on the front of the Newcastle Herald. It's referring to the story about the Williamstown residents near the Air Force Base who have found that their water has been contaminated with chemicals that are used as a flame retardant. So the kind of the foam that's used to put out fires, which was used by the RAF base, got into the water supply, and the residents some of the residents are arguing that this is very unhealthy for them. They're arguing they've experienced higher levels than normal of certain types of cancers, whereas the RAF have argued that the levels of exposure are not dangerous, therefore they don't need to do anything to compensate the residents because they are arguing that they haven't harmed them, that the levels of exposure to the chemicals are not harmful. So there's clearly the kind of two sides of this debate, and then an issue resulting from this is that the house prices in this area have absolutely plummeted. So those that are living in this area are pretty much unable to sell their house and buy a new one in a different area. So they're effectively kind of stuck there. So these are very, very social problems that are rooted in an environmental contaminant issue. So again, this is very much like a scientific approach to this would be to go out and measure the kind of amount of the chemical in the water supply, the amount of it, trace amounts in the blood of the people living there. But again, that doesn't really tell us about how are the levels at which it's deemed harmful determined by whom? Does that actually matter to the residents there? Are they convinced about that? Does that make them feel any better? Does it increase public confidence and allow the housing market to recover there? So again, we have scientific issues that can only be understood in full kind of social and sociological context. And we are also interested in the environmental sociologists are also interested in the role of social movements in promoting positive environmental change. So there's some very interesting kind of social movements around like community gardens and bike riding and all of these kind of small scale movements. And then there's larger movements such as the Friday for Future climate protests, the school strikes. So again, sociologists focus on these particular issues because they're looking at the role of social movements in driving changes in behaviors and changes in how we understand environmental issues, the degree to which we view them as a priority, the degree to which we would forego buying things we like and doing things we like in favor of addressing these issues in some way. So, why use sociology to answer these questions? I think I've probably given you a sense of why sociology is helpful to answer these questions, but just to reiterate that sociology can help us to understand how environmental problems are caused and distributed, and how environmental problems can perpetuate forms of global inequality. So, if we look at where radioactive, like nuclear waste is dumped, I think it can tell us a lot about who does and does not have the power to make decisions in a given society, and what kind of land and the people living on it are and are not valued as much. I think that will make a lot of sense if you look up where nuclear material has been stored in Australia. Sociology can also explain the effects of the environment on people and populations. So, we can look at figures of the impact of certain environmental events, but we we need a sociological perspective to understand social and cultural responses to these things. And this can also help us to understand what is and is not useful in terms of trying to put in like policies and requirements to address these kinds of like, environmental issues. Sociological approaches can tell us what will and will not be effective and socially acceptable. Sociology can also, once policies have been implemented, help to evaluate the success of policies, and can ultimately help us to try to provide solutions to environmental problems. It's really, you can design perfect policies, you can design fantastic policies, but you need people to actually abide by them and actually follow them. And the degree to which they're going to do that is often based on the social norms and the kind of culture of a group of people or an organization. So understanding that and making policies that align with that, or changing the culture in a concerted way, are the best ways forward, I would argue, for uptake of environmental policy. So, as I've mentioned, the term the environment is often associated with ideas about climate change, degradation of nature, loss of resources, pollution, and the term carries a lot of baggage. But I think it's important to keep in mind that in in sociological work, in environmental sociology, the term environment doesn't carry these special meanings. It is instead a more kind of general term. As Giddens says down here, the term environment really just pertains to the surroundings in which humans exist and their relatedness to these surroundings. So environmental sociologists are not inherently focused on climate change, for instance. Many of them are, because it's arguably, well, I'd say not even arguably, I'd say it's the biggest environmental challenge of our age. But environmental sociology is not necessarily sociology of climate change. It's not necessarily a kind of activist subdiscipline. Although there is overlap there, it's not inherent to the subdiscipline. So, when we're trying to understand some of the kind of approaches that we can use to understand how we relate to the environment, the work of Catton and Dunlop from the late 1970s is kind of helpful for understanding some of the kind of different perspectives that have come into play in environmental sociology. So Catton and Dunlop identified a distinction between what they call the human exemptionalist paradigm on the one hand and the emergence of a new ecological paradigm on the other. So continuing this work, Dunlop and Van Leary developed the new ecological paradigm through a kind of survey scale. They looked at the relationship between humans and the natural environment that was emerging in Western nations from about the mid-1970s. And they essentially argued that prior to this, humans had been viewed as separate from nature in Western thinking, as almost having a mastery over nature, as using the natural world as something that could be kind of taken from, as resources in waiting for humankind. However, the authors argued that there was an emerging view that saw humans as an integral part of nature, that rather than viewing humans as exempt from the nature, the kind of viewpoint that they termed the human exemptionalist paradigm, there was an emerging new ecological paradigm that viewed humans as part of natural systems. And so when they were trying to measure the prevalence of these views using scales within a survey instrument, the authors focused on questions related to ideas around ecological limits to growth. So we have this kind of capitalist notion that we can continue to grow the economy indefinitely. The kind of positive GDP relies on the continual growth of the economy, but in the mid-1970s, the authors argue that there were growing ideas that, there was not it was not possible to always have kind of unlimited growth, that there were ecological limits to this, that there were limits in natural resources, limits in the kind of capacity of our planet to sustain that kind of level of growth. And the scale also focused on the importance of maintaining a balance between nature and of rejecting the idea that nature exists primarily for humans' use. And so a honorary professor who's recently retired, Pam Nyland, who previously worked here at Newcastle for many years, conducted some research on the new ecological paradigm among Indonesian youth. And she found that there was some kind of uptake of these ideas. This is in the kind of mid-2010s. She found that there was kind of an idea of the need to live in harmony with nature, but a kind of uncertainty about whether humans have domination over nature. So still some ideas that nature is for humans to kind of extract from. There was a denial of the need for limits to growth, but also uncertainty about how much economic growth might need to be restrained. And so essentially, the findings of this research found that, or showed that the Indonesian youth that were researched in this context wanted to live in balance with the natural environment, but they did not want strong limits on economic growth, because they essentially, you would argue, if you don't want limits on economic growth, that often means you don't want to compromise your own kind of lifestyle and material prosperity. So I think this reflects quite widespread views. It reminds me of I think it was George Bush back about a decade ago at least, saying that while environmental issues are important, that they would not compromise the American lifestyle to combat environmental issues. And there seems to be some element of this coming through, this tension between the need to compromise on the kind of limitless growth idea on the one hand, and the desire to live in a way that's more balanced with the natural world on the other hand. So a kind of another way to conceptualize the distinction between a human exceptionalist paradigm and a new ecological rather paradigm is through the concepts of anthropocentric or kind of ecocentric perspectives. So, an anthropocentric perspective is essentially a human oriented view of the environment. And then an ecocentric perspective, in contrast, is a nature centric view of the environment. So, you can see the anthropocentric perspective essentially kind of centers the human in a way that the human exceptionalist approach similarly did, whereas the ecocentric perspective centers nature, centers the environment, centers the needs of the environment, and therefore decenters the role of people and the prioritization of human needs and perspectives. So these approaches, anthropocentrism and ecocentrism, are two different ways of understanding how ethics can be extended to nature and employed in environmental sociology. So, an anthropocentric ethic, in this ethic, nature deserves moral consideration because how nature is treated affects humans. So, this would be the kind of approach that would be taken if someone is caring about climate change because they're worried about their grandchildren. Whereas an ecocentric ethic dictates that nature deserves moral consideration because nature has intrinsic value. So, we should not just engage in conservation activities so that future generations of humans can enjoy seeing elephants in the wild. We should engage in conservation because nature is intrinsically valuable and elephants have a kind of right to exist or a value that is independent from humans. So hopefully that gives you some sense of some of the different perspectives on the environment and the way that humans relate to it. I'm going to pause here, and then we can come back to look at the constructivist versus realist debates in environmental sociology, which I think is, again, an interesting way to conceptualize environmental problems and some interesting perspectives to think through them. So I'll leave it here and I'll come back with that.